All right. Hello. My name is Bret. This is my show. And thanks for coming. So we're talking about just me. It's just me today. So we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but I'm here prepared to talk about more ARM stuff. I'm farther along in my ARM journey. I've got more experience and things to talk about. And I'm out of coffee, so I need to pour a cup. Luckily, I have a whole thermos. So let's get some questions in. Hello, everyone. I'm waving back at all of you in chat. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, I got a new mic. I'm very excited about this new Shure digital mic. Not the expensive one that you see on all the other podcasts. More of a cheaper one, but it's USB and XLR. So hopefully it does not suck. And you'll let me know if it does. Hello, everyone. All right. So I thought I would do some demos. This is going to be like a code getting into the weeds. I do have some news to talk about. Some things all kind of related to ARM. So let's just get the details out of the way. If you're the first time here, this is a live show I do every week. I talk about DevOps, talk about containers. I often have guests. And so please come back. If you would like to sponsor and keep this thing going, I've done, whatever this 121 shows now over 2+ years, then you can help support this. Let's see if that works. Yep. You can help support this on Patreon. You can just follow me there. I basically send out notifications every week. You don't have to pay. You can just click the follow button. And this is just about what I'm creating. There'll be some updates hopefully coming soon because I plan to spend the next month actually doing stuff that will get you some ARM updates, which are more complicated than anticipated, so that if you're on an Apple M1, you're taking my courses, or if you want to use Raspberry Pi or maybe an AWS Graviton 2 G series, like not the G series, but all of the instances that have G in the name for Graviton. We can talk about that. Well, actually, I can go into some details about performance and pricing and like why I think all of us now, this is the year that we're all going to be forced, mostly because of Apple, but because of many other reasons, we're going to be forced to deal with multi-platform in our applications. It's already happening with my customers who previously never had to care about ARM because they are on Apple and they are going to have to buy new machines, and they have people in their teams that they're due for new equipment and they're on the fence, right? Not everything's perfect yet. We still got rough edges, but that's why I'm here. So give me those questions. I've actually got Windows 10 running in a VM on my ARM. Let's see if I can pull that up. Let's change this one to be, yeah. So this is actually a Mac Mini running M1. I can prove that to you. Yep, chip Apple M1 with the 16 gig. It's kind of small there, but if you can't read it, trust me, it's an M1. And inside it, I actually have Windows 10 on ARM. So it's running in a Parallels VM. So it's Windows on ARM running on Mac on ARM. And there's no such thing as Docker Desktop for Windows 10 ARM yet, but I think that's sooner than we think it is. Not because of Mac, but because Windows Surfaces and other Windows devices are going to have to rapidly update all of their hardware offerings in order to now compete with the amazing performance and battery life of Apple's new devices. Like, the Windows world is not going to just sit around and let Apple be twice as fast with twice as much battery. Like, that's not going to continue to happen. So Snapdragons are going to get better. We can talk about all the other processors out there. There's a new 80 core processor for enterprise data centers that is already running ARM, and the clouds are looking at it evidently. Anyway, all sorts of stuff we can talk about. Let's go real quick, though, to a couple of news items. So real quick, about the Patreon. Go check that out. You can support me there. Buy me a coffee every month. Thank you to all my patrons. Some of you are in the chat. I appreciate you so much. And we just did our DevOps chat, which is a monthly little call that we have. If you're on the $5 plan, you get to join a Discord video chat. Well, you can really do the Discord video anytime you want, but I and others will plan to join once a month, and we all sort of talk about the projects we're on. Maybe we just start ranting about problems, or maybe we just start talking about old tech. You can also join us on Discord. So this is the Discord server where we hang out. This is where we have the monthly video for patrons, and you can jump in all of our channels and see what's going on. So I'm in there every day talking. There's lots of great people supporting the community in there. And for those of you that are in there and answering and helping people, you're amazing. Like, that's awesome. I never expected that. You know who you are. You see them all day in all the channels. And I appreciate your effort to support the community and be a part of it and involved, because it takes time to do this stuff. And one of the most magical gifts I think you can give somebody is your time. So I really appreciate all of those people in there doing that. In other news, there's a couple of good videos I want you to watch that are. This is actually not related. Victor and I are already talking. He reached out today. I'm going to have him on the show again. But I want you to go through his 2021 DevOps list, even if you just skim it, because this list is awesome. It is it's the video that I wish I made, because he breaks down, and in a 12-minute video, he goes through a lot. And then he links you to other videos that are more about those things that he's already made. So there are tons of tools here. Most of those we have talked about in some fashion on this show, but he goes pretty deep. I mean, he's talking about OPA Gatekeeper in here. He's talking about Argo workflow plus events, plus Argo CD, all in one go. Like, he's got a lot going on in here. It's not just like local developer tools, but he includes that. He talks about servers, Kubernetes deployments, the best cloud. This is really stuff not for one versus another. This is about, if you don't have an opinion and you need to make a choice right now, what should be just the easy button? Should be the thing that's most likely going to set you up for success? Doesn't mean it's the best in all use cases, but that's what he's done, and I love it, because that's really my mindset as well. Like, a lot of times, I don't want to have to research every serverless platform if I just need to get started on one. And quite frankly, a lot of these tools, since they're leaders in their segment, you're going to need to know them eventually anyway if you're going to have a career in this stuff. So you might as well just get a little bit of experience. Other news, Mirantis. If you remember Mirantis, we've talked about them a lot on this show. They bought a majority of the Docker company, as well as all their closed source assets, a couple of years ago. It's like a year and a half ago now. And pour me some coffee. They went in the fall of last year, in autumn, after the announcement from Kubernetes, from CNCF about the Kubernetes project, when they announced that they were no longer going to maintain Docker shim, which is the thing you need in order for Kubernetes to talk correctly to Docker, so that you can use Docker as your container runtime. When the Kubernetes project said, you know what, we don't really need that anymore, because the thing that Docker runs underneath the hood is called containerd, and we already talk directly now to containerd, which was the whole point all along. So we don't really need Docker in the middle. We're no longer going to maintain that shim. It didn't ever mean that Docker is irrelevant. It didn't mean you can't run Kubernetes on Docker. It just, it didn't even mean that because let's back up a second. Most people started with Kubernetes running on top of Docker, because Kubernetes itself does not technically run containers. All it does is control a Kubernetes container runtime, which the default all along was Docker. And now that's not needed anymore, because we have leaner, thinner options that just do what Kubernetes needs. Docker was heavyweight. Docker had more features than we normally needed. Now, in some cases, you do need it because it builds images, which these other runtimes don't. So sometimes people like to run Docker, prefer to run Docker. Maybe they're just used to Docker. They like the familiarity. They want to be able to troubleshoot things by using Docker commands in case things get kind of hairy. They want that safety net a little bit. I still see a lot of use case for using Docker as the underlying container runtime to build images until you eventually get to using other tools for building images. That could be a whole different show. But anyway, long story longer there is Mirantis, right after that, they, within days, said, hey, look, don't worry. If you're using Docker and you're worried about this shim getting outdated, we're basically going to fork it or create a new one or do whatever, and we'll keep supporting it. And so they support it for their enterprise customers, and then they had the open source of it, so that they basically are maintaining it for all of us. So it doesn't come out of the box with an easy Kubernetes install necessarily yet, but it is there in case you need it for eventual support, because I think by the end of the year we're going to have a Kubernetes version that won't officially support the Docker shim, the traditional Docker shim. But now we have this new thing called Cry Docker D. From what I can tell, all this really is, and let me know in chat, those of you in chat know more than me, I believe this is really just moving an existing repo over to Mirantis because it's dated all the way back to 2017. If you go look at the repo, it's got hundreds of contributors, over 100 contributors. So I think really it's just moving the support over to a different repo, and they're basically just giving you the plan. When Kubernetes 1.23 comes out, if you still want to run Docker underneath your Kubernetes, which is fine, you might have legitimate reasons for that. I think CI to me is one of the biggest ones. But when you want to simplify your CI workflow and have Kubernetes on top of a Docker running for build kit and building your images and all that kind of stuff, if you prefer that method rather than like Docker and Docker or some other tool, then this might be a solution for you. So go check that out. I appreciate that they're giving us a little bit of an update because we haven't heard much in 6 months, or really, I'm not sure of anything out of their blog. So I'm grateful for the update to know that they are on target. It's not technically like, I think it's sort of in a beta-ish release. They say it works, but they're still working on it. So anyway, they're actually, some of the nice details in here is that if you really got into the underpinnings of Kubernetes, you knew that Kubernetes technically had multiple binaries that you needed to get between Kubernetes all the way down to the Docker-D, which in and of itself actually runs container-D, which runs runc. And so there's all these binaries, right? You've got a stack of like 8 binaries probably in there if you're running Docker and Kubernetes at the same time. Anyway, they mentioned that, hey, they're going to try to make that better in the future and actually strip out some of the middle components to just have this one shim, which I appreciate because I always kind of wondered why we had all the different parts, the multiple parts there. Where we had the CRI and then we had the shim, and they're going to pull that out, sounds like, or at least they're going to try. And I'm excited for that. All right, so that's the news of the week. I will send you that blog post over into the link in the chat. Paul is saying demo on a MariaDB as a MySQL replacement on ARM. So I should just do that live because that is a common problem. There's also some other things that I think I know, but I haven't done lately. So we can also do that. One of them is, I'm wondering if there's a way to hard code your platform in the Docker client config so that if you're on an M1 Mac and you just simply want to always run Intel containers just because for now you don't want to have to deal with it, I'm wondering if there's a way to default to that. I'm thinking there is, but I haven't looked it up. Let's do it together. First up, let's just prove a couple of things. So I am talking to you on my Intel Mac. I have all these other things available. I have a Raspberry Pi in the closet. I have a Linux server in the closet. Raspberry Pi is running ARM v8 hardware, but a ARM v7 OS, which is a 32-bit OS called Raspberry, which is the default. If you get a Raspberry Pi by default, it comes with today a 32-bit OS that's not technically V8. V8 at this point, it seems that a lot of things we're kind of implying that that's 64-bit, and we can get into that. I actually am starting to create a lot of documentation that eventually you will get in the form of course updates on ARM. Who knows? Maybe even someday there'll be a whole dedicated small tiny course on just ARM stuff. But I think for now it's going to have to be in the courses, because if you're on an Apple M1, and then eventually my prediction is on a Windows 10 ARM machine, you will have to care about this cross-platform support. So Paul's got his question in. Those of you that are curious about how this will affect you, throw in your questions about your workflow, about your images. We've talked about it a lot on this show this year, so I may reference older videos, but I will do my best to give you some demos. All right. Let's go back to my machine over here. What's the status here? All right, so what I've got here, this is really kind of irrelevant at this point. This is just proving that I can, on a Mac ARM machine, run Windows ARM. One of the things about Windows that Apple has done better recently is Apple, for regular Apple apps, not related to Docker, not related to Windows 10 on ARM, running in parallels, but just on regular Apple apps, they have Rosetta 2, which does a translation or an emulation of Intel on top of the ARM processor. And Microsoft last year announced that they are also trying to do that now, which has always been the failure of ARM for Windows 10. I had an ARM Surface laptop, the very first one. Actually, it was just a Surface with a membrane keyboard, like a decade ago. I had the very first one. I was all in on ARM for Windows 10, but it was horrible because it was super slow. The battery life was better, but not so much better to outweigh the fact that it was incredibly slow and there were no apps for it. The only apps were the ones in the store, and the store at the time, 10 years ago, was, at the early days of Windows 10 was pretty poor. In fact, I don't even think it came with Windows 10. I want to say that it came with Windows 8 something, 8.1, 8.0. I don't think it started with Windows 10. So that's just proving that works. I'm going to go ahead and I could do a MS Info 32 just to prove that, I think. Apple Silicon, 1000 megahertz, ARM 64 based PC. It's not really giving me, let's see, a CPU. I was looking for like a CPU standard type. Oh, well. But that's good enough. That's just basically proving that it's working on ARM. What I haven't tried to do, I don't think yet, is actually run Intel apps on the new add-on for Windows 10 on ARM that allows you to run Intel apps on site. So that now I'm like nesting it multiple levels, right? Now, let's get back to M1. M1 with Rosetta 2 has nothing to do with Docker Desktop or Windows 10 or Parallels. Like those things that use low-level virtualization like Docker and Parallels, they cannot use Rosetta. Rosetta is about desktop apps, not about virtualization. In fact, Rosetta, as far as I understand it, does not support the virtualization framework in Mac. So you're not getting any benefit there. What's happening if you just start a terminal, and if I start Docker Desktop, by the way, that's the other news. I guess I should go back to that blog. Docker released last week the release of Docker Desktop for Apple Silicon. So now if you're a developer and you're on the fence about M1, this is one more reason to not wait. As well, Parallels released their official release of Parallels for M1 Mac. So that's another thing we were waiting on. It was still beta. That happened, I believe, last week or around that time. So on this machine, I've got Docker Desktop running. I've got my CLI, so I can do Docker version just to validate that it works. All right. And if I do Docker run, let's see, let's just do Debian. I'll do Slim. Oh, I think is it Slim-10, I think. Nope, 10-Slim. Let me see. I'm gonna guess until I have to go to the website. There we go. All right, it's a smaller image. It's only 25 meg. All right, so this right here, you see that down there, Arch64 or Arch64? That is a alternative name or a pseudonym or whatever you want to call it for ARM64. So in a lot of systems, you will see that instead of ARM64. There's also a naming problem that we're going to have to start dealing with. So here's my prediction real quick, in case you weren't around these last dozen episodes. So the reason that we're all going to have to care about this, you can't avoid this now, unless you're only thinking for a year or so in the future, because I'm not saying this is all going to happen next month, but this will happen. I don't see any way around it now. And I have a great video that we can go through. It's a fantastic video from one of the channels I follow on the Mac side that are talking about the inevitability of this shift to ARM. Really everything. Like all the signs are pointing to the fact that it is, for cost reasons and heat reasons, it is inevitable that we will all be running ARM in the next 5 to 10 years, just on everything. And I'm jumping on that bandwagon. Now, I could be wrong, obviously. Linus, creator of the Linux kernel, predicts that there's no way ARM isn't relevant. He's not interested. He thinks that, clouds are going to be primarily Intel, and that's probably true for the foreseeable future. But unless Intel has a surprise for us, they have nothing on their roadmap that's going to solve or compete with the CPU cycles, like the amount of work you can get done per energy or per watt, right? There's nothing matching it right now. Like ARM is getting so much better, and we're only a couple of years into this shift. I mean, obviously ARM's been around forever, but when it comes to desktop class performance and server class performance, we're like 5 years into this, right? And at least I feel like it, and I'm new to this. That's why I had Alex Ellis on the show. Jump back on my YouTube lives. You'll see Alex Ellis, who's the actual expert on this stuff. He's been doing it for a lot longer than I have. All right, so let me get this video. I'll get this video to you in a minute because I really recommend you watch it. If you have anything to do with developer or operations with hardware, which I think all of you watching do, I want you to see this perspective from how the market competes, and that these are so better right now on Apple. Apple is eating everyone's lunch on the desktop and mobile device side with their performance and per watt. That this is kind of what happened, if you remember, when my first Mac was the Mac Air in 2009 or 2008, because it was so much smaller than every Windows laptop I wanted, and its battery life was equivalent, not better, but I think it was around the same, but it was super tiny. You could put it in an envelope, in a manila envelope, right? Remember that whole, they put it in the manila envelope, and I was running on all these enterprise class, latest edition Microsoft laptops, and they were 3 times as heavy, twice as thick at least. So Apple shifted that size and forced the industry to compensate. So then suddenly you saw all of the Intel Windows stuff all shifting to that form factor as an option, right? And learning how to get smaller components, better thermal capacity, so they could fit things in smaller laptops, right? So in the same way that shifted the entire industry, because we as consumers, once we see that that's possible, we look at everything else and realize that's now old. That's now only for edge case scenarios. If I'm just a regular person, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to need this. Well, I think now with just 2 days ago, Apple announced now the desktop, the iMac for M1. So now we've got another M1 chip machine from Apple. I'm going to be holding out for all of the higher end stuff. Like, I don't know what it is, M2, M1X, they're calling it. I'm going to be waiting for that before I really start to replace a lot of my gear. And but I think when that starts to happen and we all realize, man, I don't have to have jet engine fans all day long. Like my Intel over here, you can probably hear it in the background. It's just burning away on an i9 in a laptop that just melts your face off. So that shift is going to force Windows and Microsoft to already compete, and they're already doing that. Looking at the future Snapdragons, Microsoft's building their own chips. This is going to cause them to compete. And now suddenly everyone who makes desktop software is going to have to provide both. They're going to have to provide an ARM and an Intel version, right? An x86 compatible and an ARM64 compatible version of their products. So if you make desktop software, you're now going to have to care. You can't just opt out anymore and just ignore the cross-platform support. Once we do that, developers are going to realize, oh, well, I've got ARM. I have to develop on this ARM side. I know a little bit more about multi-platform now. I keep hearing this thing about AWS Graviton servers being 40% cheaper for the equal performance. I've got my servers on the cloud. Let me go check those out because I've already figured out this ARM thing. Let me go check out the cost performance difference. And I think that difference is only going to get wider. Like the Graviton 3s will probably be even more of a gap. And so as that keeps happening, it's going to be really hard to ignore when you're someone who has $1,000 or $10,000 monthly bills on servers in the internet. And then we're going to start to see other clouds adding ARM as an option because they have to compete with AWS. If you can't compete with price and performance on AWS, then you're no longer a cloud provider. That's happened every single time AWS has been able to lower their prices. Azure lowers their prices. It's a battle. The next thing I see there is that CI companies will now provide ARM eventually out of the box by default. If you want to build on ARM as well as for your multi-platform, they're going to be providing that as a new feature and saying, hey, now for all your Apple stuff and eventually your Windows 10 stuff, you're all going to be able to build both binaries or both container images on our CI. And so you'll see GitHub Actions, you'll see all the other providers start to probably, and it may take a few years, but that's probably going to happen. And so we're going to end up in a day where you have to figure this out for your software and then start using all the tools that support ARM as well as Intel. So that's my rant. Come at me. All right. So one of the requests was Paul. Let's talk about Maria DB. So here's what that question is really about. Not everything in Docker is automatic, right? So I just did this I ran Debian. Now you notice when I ran it, I did not specify a platform. What I can do is I can add a little option there, platform. And we've talked about this before on the show. Linux, AMD, not ARM, AMD 64. And then it will then pull down another image because this is a totally different build, right? These are totally different binaries compiled for a different processor. And then if I do the same uname -a, I will get x86-64 over here. So I ran the same command twice, the same image, but I added the platform option because the way that Docker's always worked is that it will try to run the image and try to find the image for the platform of where the daemon is running. It will try to match them by default. If the image doesn't exist, it'll give you an error. This is what happens with MySQL. Docker run MySQL bash. Now this actually won't work because I think that MySQL has a startup and entry point script. So it would technically probably error out anyway, but it's not going to get that far because it's just going to tell me, you're on ARM and the only image I see is for AMD 64. We've also talked about that on the show. So, so what it does is, and this is actually a change maybe? Oh, I see. I wonder if they've enabled this. This might be new in the beta. One of you, if you've been watching the beta of Docker Desktop, I thought before it would fail. But now what it seems to be doing is it's backing up and running the AMD and it's giving you a warning, not an error. Oh, very interesting. Very, very interesting. I like this. Maybe this is how it ran all along, but I don't believe this is, I could be wrong. All right. So you're going to get this warning, and then you're going to hit, as we now know, there are certain edge cases, and the way that this is all working, thank you, Parallels. The way this is all working is something called QEMU. Now, we talked about that on the show before several times. I have previous videos on that, so we're not going to rehash all through that. But you can go look up the QEMU project. And what that is essentially a processor or platform emulator. It's all it's something that you can use for virtualization and emulation. And one of the things that we've been using in Docker Desktop all along is QEMU is sitting in there to provide you the ability to switch platforms and then it run an emulation. However, it is not a replacement for the platform. You get a significant performance hit. I'm thinking based on what I'm reading, at least 20%, possibly more in certain cases. I think it just depends on the workload and exactly what you're doing. So there's the performance hit, although what we can argue that on the M1 is so much faster that you don't notice it in most cases because it's just super fast. And secondly, not all applications work in QEMU. And I know that there's been some issues that they've been working on. The team has been actively working on this at Docker. And I probably should have someone on the show to get into the real weeds of this because, talking about the edge cases that are left, the problems that that still remain, where everything is not just super easy to run. So that did work. And that's pretty amazing because I'm pretty sure that I ran this like a month ago in the show, and it did not work. In fact, we had multiple failures when we tried to do some examples. Like I had these GitHub examples. Let's see. And then I think I did just a Docker compose up in here. Now let's, do I have bat? Nope. By the way, bat is a great alternative to cat. Oh, well, that's going to take a minute. So we won't use bat. I'm going to install these tools in the background just to see if we can get through that so we can have that feature. All right, anyway, so I'm going to cat Docker compose. And let's see. Oh, wow, I don't have Git either. I gotta have Git. Oh, maybe it's the diff I don't have. Nope, it's Git. So there must have been an update that broke some of my stuff. But I haven't checked it recently. This is not my primary machine, obviously. So we'll wait for that to finish before we do that. But inside here, when we did this demo a month ago, it just wouldn't run. And this is what I kind of expected most developers to deal with, is that they get an M1, they set up their Visual Studio Code, all their things, and then they do their Git clones and they do Docker compose up, and then things don't work because not all the images have an ARM equivalent, especially if you're making custom images like most application teams do. And so then what you could do, I don't know if I updated this file or not, you can go through some of this stuff and you can actually add platform and hard code it inside of compose files, just like you do with Docker run. You can go under each service and say platform and name it. So I'm assuming I have Vim. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so Kevin's asking about this. Yes, you override the platform. It is in the docs. Okay. Obviously, Git is Vim is not ready. Let's try code. Okay. I don't have anything on this machine. I thought I had VS Code installed. I do. Oh, that's right, because it's the insider build that works on M1 that's solving some of the problems on M1. So, yes, so what you would do here, Kevin, is platform Linux AMD 64. And when you do that, it will run. Let's save that. Go back over. It's probably gonna have to build some of this stuff too. Yeah, so that's going to build. Let's give that a minute. But that's the way you do it in Compose, and it works. But this fallback option, if it works in Compose, and maybe that's probably the problem. Maybe it worked in Docker Run with Docker Desktop on M1, but it didn't work in Docker Compose yet. So, but I'm now running the release version. So if you remember, the preview version for the M1 had the big words preview on it. And now you can see that we're on 3.3.1 now, which is the release version of the M1. So maybe that they've worked that out with Docker Compose as well. Is this done? Nope, we're almost there on that. No worries, Kevin. Mike says, a few years ago, I set up pre-release Windows 10 Core on Raspberry Pi. Basically amounted to a PowerShell engine. Didn't end up finding a good use for it. Yeah, I mean, Windows 10 Core itself, unless you're going to make it a virtualization host or you just want to install service, IIS and other things inside of there, it's not going to be a desktop, right? But now you should. I mean, I think the point of all this is that in theory, and I have not looked this up, in theory, Windows 10 on ARM should be able to run on a Raspberry Pi. Now, you're probably going to need the latest Raspberry Pi 4 and probably the 8 gig of RAM, which is their highest end, but it's still like $100, less than $100. And technically, that's supposed to be able to supports 2 monitors, right? So you could have a lightweight Windows 10 desktop. I just don't know if someone's got that to work yet, because obviously you got to deal with Raspberry Pi hardware drivers. Someone in chat, let me know if that works, if you've tried that or you've read up on that. But my Pi, over on my Pi, I just call it Pi, sitting in my network. Upstairs on my TV. It's technically running all my retro games. But you'll notice that it's a Raspberry Pi 4, but the Raspberry OS that comes with it is running a V7 style 32-bit kernel. And there are ways to replace that with Ubuntu 64-bit or to update the kernel to run 64-bit. I just haven't done it. I've left it as default. It's basically a testing device for me. For those of you that want to do my courses now on a Raspberry Pi, I'm making all these things compatible. All right, so I think we're done with that. Hopefully we've got... All right, so you'll see the database is running. If I go to my Docker desktop, you'll see down here that I've got the Postgres database running. If I do an inspect, let's see if we can find... It doesn't list me... it's not showing me which... environment, which platform it's running, but it is running on that platform. And then the other ones are all running, in theory, they're running the ARM versions. Now, one of the things we need to check is I'm going to create a real quick, okay, yes, I updated you already. All right. Code. Ooh, maybe we did this the other week. Ah, yes, here we go. Perfect. This was in February 18th when we did this. So does that work? Brew install bat. So this is a very small MySQL file, okay? I'm hard coding it to AMD 64, but what I really want to do I want to test Docker Compose and see if it'll fail back. All right? So I'm taking out the hard coding of the platform because I want it to try, because there is no MySQL ARM yet. So that's one of the core issues. So Docker Compose up. Look at that. So it's, okay, I need a password, but it started the application, which is the point. It failed back. So one of the challenges here is Docker is kind of limited in which it can't keep, like MySQL, or that's a bad example. It can't keep Debian 10 Slim of the same tag of two different platforms at the same time, it's kind of a fault of Docker because it was never, basically they assume that whatever platform you want to run for an image and a tag, when you pull it, you're choosing which platform you're going to pull. Once you've pulled it, if you want to download a different platform with that same tag, it will override the tag of the first one. And that's what happened here. See this one and this one, these two lines? This is exactly what happened with my Debian just now. We first ran the ARM one, and then when we downloaded the Intel one, the AMD 64 one, it was the same tag, just a different platform. And so it pulled down technically it's a different image. It's a different set of layers in an image. But it had to basically remove the tag of the first one, which means we can only now run the ARM version by the image ID because the tag is empty. And if we typed in Debian 10 Slim now, even without the platform flag, Docker would try to run the Intel version. So Docker run, let's see. I'm just going to do a Docker run Debian 10 Slim like that. All right. So it's giving us the warning that, hey, even though, see how it's now defaulting to the Intel, even though there is an ARM version locally? That's because the last one I ran, when I pulled it, I pulled the Intel image. It overwrote the tag. And what I really wish Docker will do is that they'll update this image ls to show us the platform on the side, because it's missing right now. In order to see the platform, I have to inspect each image. And I think that's true because there is another tag. Yeah, no trunk, but I don't think that. Yeah, that gives us just a long image hashtag. It doesn't, not hashtag. The SHA hash. It gives that it doesn't help us with the platform. So I can't see the platform when I do an image list, which I wish I could see. But that's the problem, is now that I've done this once, every time I run Docker run, it's going to assume to run. See what you see right here? It's now trying to run that Intel version on my ARM by default. So maybe for developers who they can just find the alternative image, they can just pull those once and then they have to change nothing because maybe it'll just automatically work. But it looks like now what we have in the background. Let me do a Docker prune. So it's going to delete everything. Just so that we're sure that Compose will auto-select an alternative image. So now Docker Compose up. Let's see what happens. Okay. Excellent. It's actually not excellent news, but this is the problem that I experienced. Because the image wasn't already downloaded, and you make the choice when you pull an image, not necessarily when you run it, which is a little confusing. A run command technically does a pull in the background. A run command is a combination of Docker pull and Docker create and Docker start. So it does all three of those commands in once. So when we're pulling, we're choosing the platform. And when you do a run, because it's a combo command, you can also choose the platform, and it will select when it pulls it. So here's the problem. I no longer now have a local MySQL image, and there is no ARM image. So the way I can get around this is to do a Docker pull platform Linux ARM. You can do a shorthand of ARM64 or ARM64 v8. Because there is now a v9 coming out. I don't believe that there will be a new type for v9 because I believe it's completely compatible with ARM64 v8 code. But we do have the v9 processor specs announced. Docker pull platform MySQL. Nope, I meant AMD. Sorry. Okay, so it's going to pull the Intel x86 image, and I'm not running it, I'm just pulling it. What I expect to happen is now that it's here, when I do Docker compose up, it will see that there's an image already available, so it won't try to repull the image. This is a feature of Docker compose and Docker run, is they don't default to automatically repulling a new image because there's one already on my machine. And it works. It runs it, even though it's a mismatch on the platform side. And I didn't have to specify the platform. Again, if I just did a cat Docker compose, you can hard code it in there, but one other question. Yeah, see, so if I could do a Docker compose pull, but it would also fail. So if I did a Docker system prune again, and then if I just did a Docker compose pull, which is technically supposed to pull all the images, I bet you that fails. Yeah, so because I didn't explicitly add the platform. Now, what if we have, this is a feature request right here. Let's do it on the new Docker compose without a dash. Docker compose pull. So the new Docker compose that's now built into the Docker CLI. All right, it's still going to fail. Now, here, what they need to add here is for me to specify, if I can specify the platform during a Docker compose pull, then it would pull all the images, or some feature that allows me to have like the backup, like platform order, maybe platform order, so that it will look for an ARM image. If it sees an ARM, it pulls it. If it can't find an ARM, it looks for an x86 if I specify that in a list. That does happen in a similar way when you do a Docker build x build. It's not auto-populating there, but when you do that, you can specify, it's a string array. So when I do a Docker build x build -- platform, I can do something like Linux ARM 64, comma Linux AMD 64. Okay, I can do that when I build, and there's no real ordering to it. I don't think. I mean, It may build them in order, but I believe that by default it actually builds them in parallel. That's kind of one of the new features of the build X option. It builds them in parallel. But what I'd love to see in Docker Compose is Docker Compose pull and be able to say, here's my backup option in case you don't have that image. I don't know. I feel like a lot of us, though, we're going to know what images we're going to figure this out pretty quickly, and then we're just going to update our Docker Compose files. The problem that we really am talking about here is that you're going to have a team where some of them have Intel machines and some have ARM machines. And how do you deal with this? Maybe the ARM people are just going to have a Docker Compose override file, and the way they would do this, the way you would do this is if I only have this, right? This is in my repo. And all my developers except me are on Intel. I'm the first ARM guy. So now I need what I can do is in your git ignore, I'd have to create a git ignore. Just gonna okay. Oh, that's right. The code command doesn't default. I think you have to there's like a little add-on that you have to get there. So what I want to do is I want to open up a new workspace. Yeah. Let me do a workspace. And under code, temp, MySQL. Oh, it's not a workspace. It's I just need to open up the folder. Screw it. I actually don't want to deal with that right now, so I'm just going to do this here. Git ignore. So the way you do this is in all of my Docker repos, I add Docker Compose override YAML to my git ignore. That means every developer can create their own custom overlay of Docker Compose. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to Docker Compose override YAML, and then services, I think we called it MySQL. Shoot, I don't even remember. And then platform Linux ARM64 V8. Let's just be specific there. So in my override, we called it DB. All right, so now they match. Okay, so I have my own override that tells it for all of my images to automatically use ARM. You know, at least for this MySQL one, right? So now when I do a Docker Compose pull, it should work. Oh, sorry. I did it backwards. You're probably thinking, what is he doing? That makes no sense to me. No, I'm not telling it what platform I'm on. I'm telling it what platform it needs to run. AMD 64. Duh. All right. So I'm in reverse. All right. Now when I do a pull, my override automatically applies, and it's ignored in any of my Git commits. And that's how I have every developer customize their own setup, right? I might provide a Docker Compose override.example.yaml, and then template it out a little bit to give people a way to copy that out. And then they create their own inside their own repo, and they never have to worry about committing it. And it will now work on their machine by default, out of the box. But you don't have to change this for all your developers, right? It would just be for the specific images that you have to convert. All right. Any more questions on that? Let's see, before I go to the next topic. Still, do you learn Docker after? Absolutely. Sorry, wrong message. Do we still learn Docker after Kubernetes drops support? Yes, absolutely. Docker is critical. You can't build containers with Kubernetes without some other tool to build them. Kubernetes doesn't have Docker Desktop. You need Docker Desktop. Kubernetes is still not great for local workflow. It's very complex and it's very CPU hungry. So all sorts of reasons to still use Docker. Paul says, I think the fallback to Intel version is a GA feature. I tried running MySQL in Docker Compose the other day, and it didn't work without the platform flag. Now it works with the latest release and no platform flag. Yeah, that may be a Docker-only thing. So and you know what? It could have been, I wonder if it was because I had the images downloaded. So Docker system prune, I could be wrong about this because I forget. So Docker image ls. So if I just now do a Docker run of MySQL. Okay, so no, I was wrong before. They didn't change it. The difference was I already had the image, right? So if I do a Docker, see if I can find that poll again. Yeah, it's too far back. There we go. So if I pull that image and then do the Docker run, and so that was my problem. I was confused because I was like, it just works. It doesn't just work. They've talked about it. I've been in chat where they've talked about a fallback plan. So now if I just do Docker run MySQL, it will work. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you can start to see the problem, right? You suddenly have to care about this at least a little bit. And you can push it off, like you can change that platform flag to run everything as Intel, but now you're emulating everything and you're already slowing down because you're running Docker in a virtual machine and it's already affecting performance. And now you're going to be emulating on top of that. I don't expect that to be a long-term solution for people. So then they have to figure out how to do a build of their app. And that's where I'm at with a lot of my courses is I'm taking all of the images that we're using in the courses, and a lot of them are custom tools that I made or I forked. And I'm having to update those with ARM v8. And then just because I want to support Raspberry Pis, because I have one now, ARM v7. So now that's 3 different platforms that I have to support. And when we get Windows 10 on ARM with Docker Desktop, I'll have to add a fourth one. Well, maybe not, because that'll still be Linux. So that'll still run Linux, not Windows containers. So yeah, 3. Let's see what other questions we got here. Kevin, so in reference to your Compose v2, assuming you're on a release of Docker Compose that came out in the last 9 months, 12 months, you no longer need the version in any file you're using with Docker Compose. This has nothing to do with Swarm. If you're using Swarm, you still got to use v3. But if you're using your Docker Compose, take out that version line. It's now version 2 is now officially, and I know I've probably told you before, use v2, but as of the last year, if you go to the documentation, it will tell you that the new version is actually versionless. So if you go to the docs and you go to, let's see. Yeah, see how optional since 127, you don't need the version anymore. And when you go start looking at versions, the reason this is important is because now, as of last year, 127, you can use version 2 and 3 features all at the same time with the new Docker Space Compose as well as Docker Dash Compose. And so you will see that the most current version is called the Compose specification. And so that itself might be versioned, but we don't really care about that anymore because the way it's working in the Compose command line, regardless of which tool you used to use it, the Compose command line, again, not Swarm, the Compose command line is checking the functionality per feature in the file. So when it looks up services, service name, ports, that's a feature. That's a feature of the specification, and it's going to look up exactly how that works in the current Compose specification. So I don't know that I've seen necessarily modifications to the Compose specification in the last year, so I haven't seen how that really fleshes itself out. But if more features are added to the specification, then each tool will have to update itself for that feature, but that's not a version in your file anymore. And that's great, because now we can just get rid of them and stop having to worry about that stupid version every 3 or 4 months getting out of date. Yeah, Paul and I are dealing with the same problem, and that's super confusing, right? I mean, I'm confused here, and I'm supposed to be the guy. I'm supposed to teach this, and I'm getting confused. So I almost wish there was more magic, because the Docker magic that we have now is not quite enough in my mind. I think we need a little bit more. I think we need that backup plan. We don't quite have it yet, so yeah. Oops, you're reading my text. Let's see what else we got. What else we got in your stuff here? What do you think about the Podman build the Scopio stack? I think it's fine. I just have no need for it. It doesn't really build. It doesn't work natively on Mac against the Mac itself. It needs a remote machine set up. It's designed basically for people that love the sysadmin way of doing things. They want an individual tool for each piece. And they also are primarily on Linux. That's my opinion. Now, if you're on WSL2 and Windows, you're technically primarily on Linux now if you're just sitting in the WSL2 machine. So you can use those. It's still using a daemon. It's just systemd instead of dockerd. So it does a couple of things that are kind of nice. Like it will create Kubernetes files and stuff, but it's not so compelling that it's replaced any of my tooling. Like I don't dislike it. It's kind of like IMG and all these other tools. Like there's a ton of tools that you can build images, investigate registries, do all this stuff. And they're good in certain use cases, but they're not going to replace my, kube control and Docker command lines. Like those are just bread and butter to me. Everybody should have them. But that's just me. Yeah. Yeah, Biker, I appreciate you giving me all the stuff that that you had to do. Oh wait, you didn't. All right, I'm giving you a hard time. But for those of you that have worked on ARM, like I would love some PRs on my coursework. Just saying. I am currently going through that now, so it will be out soon. It's taking longer than I had hoped. But for example, if you go looking at my repo for github.com, Bret Fisher, shpod, I think. Yeah. So in here, shoot, I don't have the latest commits. Let me go to my command line here. Let's do this. Oops. It's not what I wanted. All right. So if you look at this Docker file, which is kind of small, there's a little better. This is a true, I would say, relatively complex multi-platform image build, and most of you will not have such simple Docker files that you can do a 10-line Golang example of how to build multi-platform. Those examples to me are like the first day, and then after the first hour, like everything gets more complex. So what you'll see is I'm specifying, this is a build platform flag that comes with Docker. So it automatically gets filled in when Docker is building on a specific platform. It'll fill that in. And I can use that later, as well as target platform, which I use heavily. So you can look up these in the Docker documentation, build platform and target platform, and how they're used and why they're used. But what you'll see is a lot of me using target platform. And what this image is essentially taking all the tooling that you most commonly use for Kubernetes work and adding it all into a single image so you can have sort of a utility image for running. And for each of these applications, I have to go and convert the binary that I'm downloading, because a lot of these I'm not installing from package managers. I'm having to download the binary from GitHub. And when I do so, I have to specify a version, and that version has an implied platform in it. And so when I do that, like for example, kube control, when I download it, I have to specify the architecture. And the architecture that they use isn't necessarily the one that Docker reports when it's building on a specific platform. So you need a conversion table. And this is part of the complexity of dealing with pre-built binaries. Now, if you're building everything from source, or you're installing from package managers like apt-get or apt-yum, npm, well, not brew, but right, bundler, any of those things. When you're using those, they automatically determine your platform for you and get the appropriate stuff. If you can do that and then only have to build the other things from source, great. This is all not a huge issue. But the minute you need to download a single binary from somewhere, you have to care about the architecture. And if you want the same image for multiple platforms, which is my goal always is not to have double entry, right? Remember the dry principle? Do it once. So don't repeat yourself. That's what that stands for. So that makes me don't want a Docker file, ideally, that is built to work on any architecture that I want to support. And in this case, I want to support 3. I want to support the modern V8 of ARM. So the ARM 64, I want to support that because that's the Apple. That's the AWS Graviton 2 servers that are 40% cheaper per CPU performance, whatever, per watt. And then we have the Intel x86-64, and then we have the older 32-bit V7 that you'll see on Raspberry Pis or just older ARM V7 processors. Now, I have to do that for every single binary I want to download. So it's a little different here because on this one, see the variance? That's not a good example. That's not a good example. So here's a variance. For Helm, they use these three architecture names. They use AMD 64, ARM 64, and then just ARM for V7, a nice vague ARM, which is probably because they're building in Go, and in Go has its own platform default names that are not consistent with Docker. But then when I want to go to kubectx, notice this architecture for AMD 64 is actually called x86 64. So when I download it, I need to translate for that particular binary name, right? And it just gets, it just keeps going and going. I think that, this one, the ARM, it's not ARM v7. This one's got an ARM alpha in it because I guess it's alpha release. It's not true production. So they've tagged their architectures with alpha, which I find annoying. You've got some other ones in here, like this one is Linux AMD 64, which kind of maybe makes sense. I would think that could be a different part of the... What's weird there is that one has Linux and this one doesn't, even though they're both Linux. So that one's inconsistently named for kubectl. So yeah, this is the state of the industry, is we haven't all agreed on platform names across all the things. And it's not as easy to just say, I'm going to use uname and translate the uname inside of Linux, because those are inconsistent as well. So you're going to have to come up with your own solution. This was probably the smallest, easiest way I could figure out how to do it in a single Docker file. So this is going to be showing up in a lot of my images for the courses, and I'm just going to have to start explaining it for some of these custom ones as we go through it. I'm just going to have to get advanced. So let me check back here. Amir, no, you don't need to look back in the chat. We already answered that like 10 minutes ago. No, you do not need to stop learning Docker. You absolutely should learn Docker. Docker is no less important today than it is 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago. You absolutely need it. You're not going to need it running in your Kubernetes clusters, but let me ask you, in your Kubernetes cluster, how often did you type Docker commands? Probably not very often. If you're running Kubernetes, you're just running Kubernetes commands, and it talks to Docker. So it was kind of irrelevant in terms of whether you needed to learn Docker. But when you're learning containers, you need a tool to start with, and that is not containers. Like, that's not Kubernetes. You don't learn containers by learning Kubernetes. You learn containers by learning Docker, and then you eventually evolve to learning Kubernetes. But it doesn't make Docker obsolete. Kubernetes is probably a little much for running on a single machine. It's probably a little too complicated for running in local development for most people. So you're still not going to need it. What is the extension to make code open VS Code from terminal? I think just Google it. So I have to look this up every time, but yeah, there's a command you have to do to get it installed. Yeah, shell command, install code command and path. Oh, that's right. It's actually in the GUI. So if I go into the command palette, come on. There we go. Yeah, shell command, install code insiders, because I'm using the insider ones. So I've already used that. So now code insiders. No? Oh my goodness. Let me try it again. So Command Shift P, and then just search for shell, and you'll get the shell command. And then of course, And then for my actual, so I have insiders because it was better on M1, but I bet you the regular, I bet you the regular VS Code, which I haven't checked recently, the VS Code is probably updated. And then in this one, I got to do the shell thing to install the command as well. So yeah, it's inside the app. No extension needed. Good question. Yeah, that's the biker. That's the ARM HF is V7. So I'm building all the images for V7 as well as V8. I was trying to do V6, which is like really old pies. Probably nobody would need it, but I just kind of wanted to go over the top. But there are so few things that are actually built for V6 that it wasn't worth the effort. So I scrapped that and went back to just supporting Raspberry Pis out of the box, supporting our Apple M1s out of the box, and supporting AWS Gravitons out of the box. That's my goal. Oh, sorry, Amir. I misread your question. So sorry about that. You need to learn both. Learn Docker first. If you want to tinker with Docker Swarm, that's up to you. At this point, Docker Swarm still works, but I think for any real business use, it's only the smallest of teams that can really use it. And persistent storage continues to be a problem that I know they're working on, but we're all tired of waiting. So the reality is if you have a DevOps job today, or if you're a developer today in a team, you're probably going to have to deal with Kubernetes. So it's not, for most of us, I'd say for the vast majority of us that are having to deal with containers in production, it's not a matter of if, but when you have to learn Kubernetes. Swarm is optional. I still use Swarm, but it's not, like people aren't paying me to help them with Swarm. I'm not deploying lots of new things on Swarm. I'm just kind of using it to run certain things because it's easy, utilities, nothing that has persistent data that I really care about. It's not necessarily super unreliable in some cases. It's just, there's just the features that we all have gotten used to in Kubernetes just aren't there in Swarm. So once you've gotten over the hump of Kubernetes and you've learned it, and you're comfortable and you're not intimidated by it, then I find that the reasons every year it gets easier and easier to run and maintain Kubernetes and update it with all of these new deployment tools we have. All the clouds now have a way to run it without you even having to install it. So yay, because I don't want to have to do that if I don't want to. And Swarm continues to be something that you have to manually deploy and update and take care of. So I used to say, 3 years ago that, do Swarm first. If you don't need Kubernetes, avoid going there. But I think at this point, there's been lots of promises made on Swarm. Very few of those promises have been kept. And I'm not anti-Swarm, but I also am a realist. And I don't see very many teams. I haven't seen a team recently deploying Swarm at all, like in the last year. I haven't had any consulting clients in the last year or year and a half, 2 years, choose Swarm for anything. There's just too much Kubernetes stuff out there. All the cool stuff is being done on Kubernetes. So as much as I love Swarm, it's not where the action's at. So the innovation isn't happening there. All this GitOps stuff. There is now finally a tool for GitOps on Swarm, which is called Swarm Pack, Swarm Sync. I have not tried it, so I'd love to hear back from anyone who's given it a shot. But if you want to automatically update YAML with your app stuff and then have it synced with Swarm like GitOps will do on Kubernetes, then check out Swarm Sync. And I hope it works for you. I think the biggest thing we're all lacking in Swarm really to still make it a viable solution in a lot of cases is an open source, out of the box or easy to install persistent data solution for a multi-node cluster. We had that for a while with RexRay. I loved RexRay, but ultimately all of the companies that were willing to sponsor that project just quit. They just stopped supporting it. Dell was doing it. VMware was doing it. And then they realized that they weren't going to make any money on it, and that everyone was interested in Kubernetes and everyone else was working on Kubernetes. So they shifted their teams to Kubernetes, which was probably the right decision. I wish it wasn't the decision. I wish we still had a vibrant Swarm community. But I think at this point, it's more interesting as a basic getting started and to try a few things and to see how easy it could be. And then to realize, yeah, you're probably going to have to need to learn Kubernetes anyway. So, yeah, I like Eric's excellent short example. To learn Kubernetes, you need to learn containers. To learn containers, you need to learn something. And Docker is the most popular solution for that. A great way to say it. How is Cryo, if compared to Docker, as many are saying is going to be the main container thing for Kubernetes? The point is, if you're doing Kubernetes, unless you're making your own custom distribution of Kubernetes, you probably will never really care about the runtime in Kubernetes. So Cryo versus Containerd is not an argument that I care to have. It's going to be chosen by your distro. The only people that I believe, by the way, on this comment, not to sound a little negative, but I'm going to say it. The only people I hear saying that Cryo is default is Red Hat and the Red Hat world. Everyone else is defaulted to Containerd. Containerd in every survey is more popular than Cryo. It's not that Cryo's bad. It's just not. It's the least used of all three container runtimes. That's not a bad thing. It works fine. If Red Hat's willing to put all their enterprise customers on it, I'm sure it's great. But I'm just using whatever the tool is that I installed Kubernetes provided. And in every other case that I'm aware of, the default is now Containerd. So, but you don't need to learn Containerd, really, not unless you're a super hardcore systems geek. You can just avoid that. Like, I would ask you, if you're going to bother learning Containerd, did you bother learning the intricate API workings of the controller manager or of the scheduler? Because those are other Kubernetes components. How much do you know about etcd and the core DNS? Because those are Kubernetes components. So in the same way, I don't think you need to worry as much about the runtime anymore. Once you've learned Docker, great. You know how to build containers, run containers. When you're moving to Kubernetes manages all those components for you. It's the one that has the job of managing, 7 components, something like that, thereabouts, and 5 to 7. Yeah. So, that's not including ingress and, all the other optional add-on controllers that you're going to need. That's just like the basic stuff. You don't have to learn each one of those to their intricate level until you become someone where your entire job is to build and maintain Kubernetes clusters. If that's your job full-time, then yeah, you probably should know as much as you possibly can about how it's built, all the different components, how they communicate, which protocols are they using, how they authorize and authenticate to each other, how RBAC works. Like, you need to know all that stuff. But for the rest of us, we don't really have to care. It just works. And when it doesn't, then we suddenly have to care. Biker, that's a good conversation. Everything I've seen on ARM HF is 32-bit. So, what is it, LF and HF? I forget the two. But both of them run on my Raspberry Pi, and it's a 32-bit OS. So, if you get a document on that, send it my way. As much reading as I've done, my understanding is to compile in 64-bit on ARM, the first one you do is ARM V8, ARM 64, and anything below that, like HF and the older one, whatever that is, LF, or I forget the terminology. Those are technically 32-bit. I think it was something about the HF had certain extensions in the newer processors that could take advantage of it. But I could be wrong. That's just what I've read. But that's the complexity of ARM builds, right? Kubevela. I've not even heard of Kubevela. Don't know what that is. What if your on-premise Swarm is not enough and K8s is too much? I would argue that K8s is no longer too much. Like just if it's too much, like what is too much? Kubernetes install is too much, then use Rancher. Kubernetes manifest is too much, then you might be surprised that Docker is working on a compose to Kubernetes deployment mechanism, or look up Customize or Helm, because actually those are kind of a little more complicated than manifest. But I would argue that once you've got your manifest set, it's not really that hard. It's just the initial learning of it, which I have courses on, so you can take that stuff, learn the basics, and then once you've got your manifest designed, you're done. I mean, yeah, it sucks. It's 3 times as big as your compose files, but most people, once they have their initial manifests, they make a new one. They just copy and paste out of an existing one. So the hard part is making your first ones. And in my Kubernetes Mastery course, I teach you how to do that from scratch. I teach you how to use the API, the command line, the documentation to build them from scratch without you resorting to like copying, pasting from blogs, right? So that's the hard part. That should take you a few days to get that perfected. But Hans, I hear what you're saying. I, at this point, would not recommend Nomad. I know that there's people that love it, and I see that they're actively working on it. But this is all about like learning a tool is temporary, but living in an ecosystem where the entire ecosystem's energy is thrown at a specific tool, and then you're doing the tool that none of them are working on, like you're going to end up having a harder time. Because the thing about Kubernetes is once you realize that, like Swarm, like Nomad, that it's a platform that you're going to want to put GUIs on. You're going to want to get metrics out of it. You're going to want to add ingress, and you're going to want to add more troubleshooting tools to it so that you can build out your systems. You're going to realize that for Swarm and Nomad, none of the vendors out there are building tools for it. They're not adding their functionality to it. Some of them, if they had prior Swarm support or Nomad support, they're keeping it. But I don't see vendors adding that, right? And certainly not en masse. I mean, there's a new product launch like every day on something for Kubernetes. Whether or not you need it is a different debate. But I would argue that the world is so Kubernetes now that you're swimming upstream to avoid it. And it doesn't mean you have to build your own clusters. If you're doing on-premise, you can buy Rancher. You can use Rancher for free. If you want something that's even tinier and simpler in terms of like less resources, you can use K3S with Ketchup. I wouldn't use K0s or Kos or however you want to say it, just because that's new and it doesn't have near the wide adoption that Keys does with K3S. So I would, if you're going to do, so here's the thing about K3S though, you still have to install it and your manifest won't change. So whether you use Rancher or VMware or AWS for your Kubernetes, like whether you use any of these things, your manifest will always be big and they will always have all the YAML. And that's just, it's kind of a fact of life. Like if you're DevOps nowadays, you have tons of YAML in your life and it sucks, but it's there. Like it's better than what we used to have. Like remember Windows INI files back in the day? Like, there are worse things than YAML. So I would say that I would advise you to get over the hump. And personally, I think that most businesses, unless you're just toying around with the idea of Kubernetes, you're probably going to want something that's well-maintained like Rancher. You can start with Keys or MicroK8s. I like MicroK8s as well. But there's something about having an entire company and their revenue model wrapped around the quality of a product like Rancher or GitLab. It's an open source product and they depend on their subscriptions, their support services for money. They're going to make that product good and well supported versus a purely open source project that is not clearly defined in the revenue model of the company. So I tend to find that those things like GitLab and Rancher are just, They cover all the edge cases. They have a ton of features out of the box. Their upgrades are very easy in terms of supportability and well tested. So those are the things I look for especially when I'm doing on-prem, because I don't want to have to maintain a bunch of custom stuff that no one else knows how to do. I don't want to have to do that. I want to use what's most popular. And by far, I think absolutely by far, Rancher, when it comes to free on-prem deployments of Kubernetes, I don't have any data to back this up. But from everything I've seen, Rancher and RKE are it. Like, that's the way to go. Everything else is a fraction of that. Now, granted, there's paid editions. There's obviously lots of VMware stuff out there. Now, I'm not knocking VMware, but people tend to default to Rancher and then go with something else when they find a reason to not do Rancher. I'm not a fan, by the way, of vanilla upstream, and you've probably heard me say that before. So I don't recommend you make custom bespoke Kubernetes clusters unless that is your job to do that, because you're required to do that. I very recommend you use a distribution like Rancher. So, Becker's got more information. Our HF is for ARM processors with hardware implemented floating point instruction set. Okay. Plus 32-bit instruction set. 64-bit ARM supports hardware floating points and Neon by default. So no need to specify a qualifier like HF. Yeah. There you go. Thanks, Biker. That's way more than I actually learned. I just wanted to make sure that I had the right build flags to make sure it would work on a Raspberry Pi. So that people, because I do get people that take the courses and say, hey, this doesn't work on my Pi. And I'm like, yeah, sorry. There's dozens and dozens of images in the courses, and not all of them build for every ARM release. So... Oh, yeah. Eric's mentioning that there's a new O'Reilly book, Production Kubernetes. I have not read it yet, but it's on the to-do list. Was it Burns? I'm trying to remember who wrote that book. And with a lot of these, if you wait long enough, somebody's going to give a portion of it away or all of it away. Here we go. We're talking about this book. So, Production Kubernetes. If you're on Rancher, Rancher has Rancher Academy. So you can go take an entire free course. After you learn basic Kubernetes, like something from my course, you can go and take this course to learn Rancher and watch videos. I don't know how many videos there are. I know there's more than a few. But I don't know how many videos they make. But Adrian over at Rancher makes those, and I know he's a very good speaker and focuses on quality of videos. So I would expect that course to be good and worth your time, especially for the price of $0. So if you're considering Rancher, you'll need basic Kubernetes knowledge first, and then you can look at that. Yeah, thanks, Eric. All right, let's do a last couple of questions. I'm going to wrap this up. Navron, why Rancher and not OpenShift OKD? I've just never been an OpenShift person. I don't think the majority of people choose OpenShift when it comes to, like, at this point, I've got hundreds of thousands of people that have taken my course. I get dozens of people that talk to me through consulting every year. So I feel like I've got, stuff, good stuff. I talk to people at conferences, and unless you live your life in Red Hat world, which lots of people do, I just don't happen to live in that world. I live in the world of the cloud. The enterprises that I see, they're largely, they might be on VMware, but they're not necessarily committed to Red Hat Enterprise. So, the people that are on those platforms, yeah, they'll choose something like OpenShift, but for the rest of us, we tend to default to Rancher. And OpenShift, in my mind, and this is not an educated opinion, it's just more complex. OpenShift is more complex, but I could be wrong at that. And Eric's saying there's a free version already, a free version of that PDF book. So I don't dislike OpenShift. Let's be clear on that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it if you want to do it, but from what I see on the internet with the people that I, every day I'm in my courses helping people, consulting with companies, talking to other people in the community, talking to other leaders from conferences and stuff. And it's not that I don't see OpenShift being used. It's just for people that are using OpenShift, it seems like that the decision to use OpenShift was made for them. Or they had a specific requirement, in other words, that forced them to use OpenShift. And those requirements may be that they were using Red Hat, they pay for Red Hat, or they have, someone up high decided that they were going to do that, or I don't know. There was I don't know that at this point there's a specific feature in OpenShift that isn't available anywhere else. So I'm not sure that there's a competitive feature like that, but there might be. I'm just not aware of it. Yeah. I mean, there's going to be tons of organizations, like Martin's saying, there's going to be tons of organizations that are OpenShift. Now, why they did OpenShift, every developer, every sysadmin has their preference for OS, has their preference for vendors. Sometimes it's about existing vendor contracts. Sometimes it's about supportability. Can you pay for support, and how much does that support cost? Sometimes it's about what do you already know. Are you already a RHEL and CentOS person? Then you might, default to things that are coming out of that community. So I am not in that community. Most of the people I see in the container world are into the Debian and its variants like Ubuntu. The Debian community by default, and using the app package manager and all those things, which you can still use OpenShift with. But again, it's just about ecosystem and community, I think, and I'm just not in it. So I hate to give you a reason to not use OpenShift. I just don't see it as the default go-to number one in the communities that I'm involved in. So, but great question, great discussion. Thanks for that. I appreciate that. We all have our preferences. All right, so here's the plan. You've got KubeCon coming up next month. You've got DockerCon coming up next month. I will be doing something at KubeCon, I think. So here's the idea. And thumbs up this video, make a comment, come to my Discord and tell me in the Discord. Remember up there, Discord, devops.fan. That's our free Discord server. We hit over 4,000 people on the server now. Hit some likes if you want to do something with KubeCon. So the idea that was presented this week with the DevOps High Fivers group, my Patreon supporters, thank you to all those over here that are supporting. For my High Fivers group that are buying me a coffee every month, we talked about a watch party for events, or just to watch a YouTube video together. Instead of creating content, what if we just watch the YouTube video together? And Discord is actually a really great way to do that. Someone could be presenting it or sharing it in Discord while we sit in a chat channel. We don't necessarily voice chat. Maybe we just text chat. And Discord is a great way to do that. And you can support up to, I think it's like at least 100 people concurrently, even with voice. And so what I thought about this idea of something that doesn't require me to make a bunch of content or to host some sort of big event. Like for KubeCon, would y'all like to do something in Discord, in my Discord server, where we basically have a video room and maybe a chat channel, some dedicated channels to KubeCon. KubeCon itself will have its own Slack, and that's probably a place that you should go if you're going to pay for KubeCon and be there. But I thought, well, what if we did our own thing and we talked about what we were viewing? I don't know. It's just an idea where we could watch videos. Part of the problem is, if you're not paying for KubeCon because it's not a free event, I'm probably breaking some rule around redistribution of the content. So I don't know. I had an idea. So throw it in the chat, throw it in the comments. Basically, how do you hang out with friends while you're at KubeCon and learn stuff together? Or, because when I go to the virtual conferences now, I don't watch I don't watch very many videos. I might skip around, but I usually end up just waiting for the YouTubes and then kind of skipping around some of them. But that's about it. And with KubeCon last year, the Discord or the Slack was heavily used especially in the community ones. And I don't want to take away from that, but I thought about it. Eric saying +1 to Discord watch party. Yeah, I wouldn't mind trying to figure that out. Maybe we just figure it out live in Discord and create some channels and play around with it. So for DockerCon, coming up next month, remember to sign up, dockercon.com. I will be live streaming at least 3 of these live shows during the event where I will have guests, and we're going to be talking about 3 of my favorite things. One of them will be CI and CD. We'll be talking about GitOps, and we'll be talking about serverless infrastructure for containers. I don't mean necessarily functions as a service. I mean running containers without having to run servers. And we're going to have 3 different panels, and I don't have all the details yet, but that's what's going to happen there. And DockerCon will be a free live community event that you can join at the end of May. All right, so those things are happening. Next week is all about my courses. I will have a course Q&A. So if you're actively in my courses, come back next week. It's going to be all like this. It's going to be chatting and Q&A. And I will see you next time here on YouTube Live. Thanks for coming. Ciao.